While Italy's releasing emergency funds, European finance ministers are meeting to discuss the so-called corona bonds. They need to come up with ways to share the burden of the economic downturn. But there's many disagreements ahead. Ireland's Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, told Euronews the levels of coordination between EU member states had been poor and called for access to large amounts of cash to be shared with those member states most affected by the current crisis. Jack Parrott reports for us from Brussels.
The flow of the euro is in for a cut. Economic recession looms. The 19 finance ministers from the single currency euro are tasked with coming up with a way to spread the financial burden. Corona bonds, now an unpopular word. But there's a call for countries to club together to take on debt collectively. Flatly refused by the Netherlands and disliked in Germany.
In their view, they've been really careful over the past couple of years. They've built up a war chest of money to save for a rainy day. And so they're worried that other countries like Italy, which didn't do that work and now is in trouble, will sort of drag them all down if they all have to sort of stand behind these bonds.
The European Central Bank is buying 750 billion euros in single government's debt, but insists that pooling debt together is also needed. The European Commission is proposing a 100 billion euro scheme to back loans to companies to prevent them from laying off workers. And France is suggesting a 10-year limited fund which all countries would contribute to help the hardest hit. Finance ministers know they need to work the European Stability Mechanism into the solution. The bailout fund, set up after the 2008 financial crisis, can get its hands on around 700 billion euro. Economists say the tools are there.
If this explodes into a full-blown Eurozone crisis, then it would be a sort of a huge crisis, self-inflicted crisis that's really totally unnecessary. Strong policy response will allow us to manage this crisis, and we have the scope and the capacity to respond, and we should really respond.
Plans for Europe's economic recovery are testing the seams of the bloc's unity. Jack Parrott, Euronews, Brussels.
Let's find out a little bit more. Shona Murray, our correspondent, joins us live now. Morning, Shona. What have the EU leaders been saying about this idea of corona bonds?
Well, actually, Rosie, the majority of Eurozone leaders are actually in favour of this idea of corona bonds. Initially, a few weeks ago, we had the first 9 EU leaders signing a letter saying now was the time to create a mechanism for joint Eurozone debt to help struggling member states fight, at least from a financial point of view, the impact of the coronavirus. Those countries, Italy, France, Spain, big pro-EU countries normally, Ireland, Portugal were all behind it. Subsequently, we had 4 more member states, EU, Eurozone member states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, saying they felt the same. But they came, flat against resistance from the likes of Germany and the Netherlands, Finland and Austria. But in particular, the Dutch reaction was seen as quite a low blow. The Dutch finance minister said that some of these member states should actually be investigated for not having the firepower already in place, built up to react to this global epidemic. And that was seen as quite a low blow. And there's been really huge questions about the lack of solidarity around the Eurozone and the EU from this virus. And I asked the Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, who was, as I said, one of the 9 who supported corona bonds, about his assessment of the EU's lack of coordination.
Now we're trying to see a coordinated financial response because it is inevitable that this emergency is going to hit every economy in the European Union very hard. So certainly what I'd like to see is an agreement from the Eurogroup, from the finance ministers, and also after that, at a head of government level, is an agreement to make money available, loans available at a very low cost, at a very low interest rate for a very long term to member states to help them pay for this crisis and also help them to reboot their economy. And I think that is possible.
There have already been many disagreements over this sort of financial aid package, Shona. How problematic might these corona bonds be, just in terms of the cohesion of the bloc as a whole?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we saw that quite unedifying European Council meeting a couple of weeks ago where EU leaders spent several hours in a teleconference arguing over this issue and really gave such a limp response, which disappointed many people. But yesterday we heard Chancellor Merkel saying that the EU is now facing its greatest test since its foundation. A woman, of course, we know, not prone to exaggeration. And it seems that there is a real turnaround amongst member states and amongst finance ministers to get this issue sorted now, to ensure that there is enough financial firepower but also enough solidarity, because that is a huge concern. I even heard from a source last night saying that the Dutch position has lost all credibility and that finance ministers will try their best to probably use the European Stability Mechanism, the Eurozone's bailout fund, to issue money to countries that would have, very, very low interest rates for very long periods of time with very few terms and conditions. Nothing like a bailout scenario